Thank you very much. Good morning. Should I just create a moment? I know there's always a problem when someone starts speaking and you're at the back of the room, that then it just doesn't feel appropriate to walk to the front of the room. So anyone who still needs to come and wants to sit down? Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. So I am going to do some reflections that are a little bit about just reflecting and somatizing on what we've been discussing in the last days. I unfortunately didn't hear Indy's opening presentation, but as a close colleague and friend and collaborator, a lot of it is something that we are in constant conversation about. I was just digesting yesterday across the whole of what we were discussing and thinking, if we're going to open up today, maybe I can be useful in channeling in some of those different sets of reflections, and I'm going to channel them into an argument for what to invest in. So you could be thinking about this from the perspective of somebody who's out there in the world arguing for what your role, what you are doing, and where it fits, and why it fits, and what it's part of. Or you could be listening to this from the perspective of somebody who is holding resources and curious about what it is that could be done or how to think about it. Or you could be just listening to this from the perspective of, this is a topic I'm passionate about, and it's very helpful to have somebody sense make so I can challenge everything that I am about to say. That is the invitation for this morning. I am speaking as somebody who embodies what I'm talking about, mainly because one of my problems in life is that I spent the first 11 years of my life as a cultural historian, expert in Italian medieval and Renaissance cities and the construction of Europe's culture, and many of some of the really deep, deep roots, the cultural originations of what it is that we've inherited and are living now. So it's often something that I'm going to just take a moment to draw from a couple of those elements because some of those lessons are relevant now. But I wanted to start with what we really are fundamentally talking about. Because it does concern me that one of the challenges of the question of climate and culture, the climate-culture nexus, the climate and nature culture nexus, is the profound ambiguity of the terms that we're using, the ways in which they're used with less or little or relatively partial reflection. So I really wanted to just take a moment to reflect. We are talking about the capacity, the human capacity for self-transformation. And that really is the thing we need to remember because it is at the core of what we're dealing with. We will not survive the world that we have made, and we are the only ones that can change it. And that is also important in thinking about how do we think about changing some of the deep work that Ella was talking about yesterday I want to come back to, because there's also a lot of naivete in the ways in which we are discussing how nature is going to save us. We are going to have to save ourselves. So I wanted to really come back and just take a moment to think about when we say culture, what are we talking about? It is the frame, it is not the frame, it is the foundation. It is a capacity to self-transform. And most importantly, we are slippering around, and this discourse and the, for example, European Union, European Commission discourse particularly about this is unfortunately rather superficial. So is a lot of what's happening when I think about philanthropic funding or the debates about it. So I do want to come back to one of the citations yesterday that Ella made about enculturation, sociology, anthropology. This is Pierre Bourdieu. One of the most important things to remember about culture is the fact that it is what he described as habitus. It is a combination of habitus, of resources, of field. He talked about the fact that there is a practice. It's our dispositions, it's our ways of showing up, it's our entanglement with what we grew up with, it's our entanglement with habits, it's our deep, deep coding from family, context, environment, mindset, practices, behaviors, and so on. And when we talk about culture and climate, we are almost never actually naming that. What we're actually talking about is some of Europe's largest market cap businesses, creative industries, cultures, the act of making, of culture making. And one of the things that I find most concerning about that is because of the forking of our civilization in the Enlightenment, around 200 and 250 years ago, we turned culture into something that's a little bit like a nature reserve, with a lot of its own sense of rights. You don't get to tell me what I should do as an artist. You don't get to curtail my freedoms of expression. We have created this odd marginalization and some degree of self-marginalization, rather than working out how the hell do we go back to source code and start to understand culture is about how we make our sense of self, and it is about how we change our sense of self. So this is what I wanted to do, was just take a portfolio approach to what we mean when we're talking about culture and its relationship to the power, the possibility, and the act of human self-transformation and self-remaking. I would definitely not take photographs of this. This is also me experimenting with different AI sources for what do you need to do when you want to create a deck of slides. I consider these to be marginally interesting, aesthetically horrible. So don't kill yourselves. So I want to start with this, and I'm just going to go through. It's almost like making a map of, if I was speaking to philanthropic foundations, look at your engagement in this space from a portfolio perspective and think about how is that portfolio placed? Where are you engaging? And I want to just unpack each of those as a frame and then draw in a sense of how does that relate to some of what I heard being discussed or reflected upon yesterday. So the first one, obviously, is absolutely at the core, and that is the question that Ella opened up yesterday on ontologies. Who are we? Our fundamental understanding of self. And our fundamental understanding of self as a root cause issue, and in particular, the problem of the Abrahamic religions and the problem of every single major cultural identity that has taught us and grown up with us, Genesis 1:126, that has taught us that we have a relationship with the natural environment, which is one of dominion, of power, of the rights to extract, of the rights to protect and invest in our own interests. And the question is, that is a core identity structure. It's a meaning structure. It's incredibly hard to undo. When we talk about deep work, we say it. But meaning that, changing that, really fundamentally changing that, requires unlearning, recoding a hell of a lot of established practices and understandings for literally millennia in some parts of the world. So the question is, how does our own practice of cultural thinking, cultural imagination, our own understanding of being part of a tissue of practice and of relationships help us do that? And there are a number of things we need to know about that. Irony is one of the most important. Irony is a capacity to take distance, to see yourself. It's the subject-object transfers that mean you can suddenly actually see and create just a tiny wedge of separation to be able to notice who is the human. It's the wedge that you need to do what Indy's arguing for in thinking about what does it mean to be human and how are we observing that. And that is why, and I would like to offer a small moment of, yesterday I decided to stay quiet but had a little bit of a moment, because the debate up here, was it Ollie? Ollie, am I remembering person? Where am I? There you go. You're hiding. Okay. That question to you, are you an artist? I nearly had a moment myself personally. Like, what box are you being put in? Why are you being put in a box when what you're doing is playing with an ironic capacity to observe, to put distance in ourselves, between ourselves and our behaviors? The capacity to notice, observe, to play, to get humor, to help us see the implications of this. This was a major installation in Palazzo Grassi in Venice, so that every boat coming down the canal could look at that and think, why are these hands propping up the palace? It's exactly why I celebrate so much the work that Anab is doing. And I want to remember and recall that fabulous phrase that she used yesterday. So you create experiences and imagination that means that the future stops being an idea and becomes a memory. Irony, experience, imagination, and imaginaries. The one thing we know that we need are social imaginaries for the future. And that huge problem of the fact that we have been describing a catastrophic set of changes without describing, inhabiting, and experiencing what it means to live in a world that is climate changed and what it means to live in a world in which we won. This is why Rob Hopkins' presentation last year, if any of you were here, is so important. What does it mean to live in a future where we transformed ourselves? So how we engage culture, arts, and creativities to genuinely invest in social imaginaries feels immensely important. Mostly I find it quite superficial. So my challenge is, how do we really ask it to go deep? But we can't transform if we can't let go. And this is also one of the things that was mentioned yesterday I want to bring back in the world. We need grief. We need catharsis. It is not an easy thing to accept a world in which you won't be able to make choices that you grew up with, that you thought were normal. And there are places in the world that are actively trying to explore that. This is in Singapore, trying to create the context in which people can start to experience and imagine, but also grieve and let go of the world in which we are. And if I look at what I'm experiencing, the needs to create a capacity to grieve in order to create, to be and feel and name uncertainty in order to reimagine is absolutely critical. So we know that this is all true, this stuff is needed. The question is, just to go back to this whole kind of core point, how are we actually investing in this? Because I don't see very much where we really deeply, thoughtfully invest in how is it possible to reimagine the human. We're naming it, we're not yet fully reinvesting in it, and not at the scale that we would need. So that's one kind of a very first sort of reflection. The second has to do with education. I run an organization that has a significant component of what it does in teaching people. I can pick up funding tomorrow for any aspect of STEM education. My son has gone to university in Canada because Europe has renationalized all of the education for its undergraduate universities in STEM. So no more teaching of English, teaching STEM subjects in English in European universities. They've all gone back to European languages. Why? Because it's considered to be so at the forefront of competitiveness that Europe should have STEM-educated students. The capacity to reintegrate art and science into our educational system allows us to tap into the core capabilities that culture and cultural transformation unlock, which are the core functions of what it means and how it is that humans engage. And again, same phrase from Anab yesterday, we have always thought with our bodies. We think not just with our minds, but with our bodies, and we always have. So if we want to change... science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the particular constellation of educational, curricula that come from the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the sense of turning humans into cogs, into productive machines, which is really what that was all about. So if we want to think about how we're going to change worlds, now the problem is we don't have time to do this. We don't have time to do this slowly, so how do we speed it up and do it much faster? But reintegrating and changing our core educational capabilities means responding to something that someone called Helga Novotny argued for years in her role setting up the European Research Area. How do you reintegrate arts and sciences as quickly as possible? Again, my question is the investment logic of this. Because very often what happens is that you maybe ask people to do a leadership course or a consciousness course, but very rarely is there a really systematic conditionality, a requirement that every single euro, dollar spent on education should require the reintegration of humanities and the capacity to trigger all of these capabilities in the human system as part of any form of educational practice. Because if we can't name, if we can't imagine, if we can't think of a world, if we can't embed a notion of understanding, we certainly can't enact it. And most importantly, what it actually does is allow us to fully unlock both hemispheres of our brain. Again, one of the challenges that we have is that we are running increasingly in a context where our limbic systems are taking over, especially at the moment. Think about our conversations yesterday. Each of us is often starting to speak from a place of deep anxiety. That means our limbic systems are running harder, faster than our prefrontal cortex, than our capacity to integrate both lobes of our brain, than our capacity to create generative, creative possibilities. And it's the reason why last year I really called upon us to remember what Gregory Bateson was doing with an ecology of mind, the grandfather, the founder of cybernetics, talking about the power of human capability in a connected mind, in multiple connected minds, and the notion of how you fully integrate and unlock the entire spectrum of capabilities that are somatic, physical, consciousness, imaginative, creative, and so on. How many times do we find ourselves in rooms deciding and discussing what it is that we're going to do, where that's a core that's a core conditionality, a core requirement? So, again, if we're thinking about where do we invest, how do we invest, reinvesting, reintegrating, retraining ourselves to put these pieces back together, not, and this is why I was having such a moment yesterday, not as the practice of artists who are tokenistically brought into the room to help other people be creative, but as a core human capability brought to every single moment in which we are in and are faced with. I'm going to do a small exercise on this one, because it's very hard to argue that you're massively investing in culture and creative industries if you don't also actually clean up the act of culture and creativity industries. And this was also mentioned yesterday. There are 2 or 3 things that I wanted to just go through very quickly. One is the obvious, very low-hanging fruit. This is a music festival a couple of months ago in the Netherlands. But this is the biggest one, design. 80% of emissions are locked in at the stage of design. Now, that really is where we need to start thinking about this much broader understanding of culture as habitus, as practice, as dispositions, not the tiny preserve of culture and creativity as artistic practice to help people feel guilty and maybe a bit more creative, but the ways in which we go after the very biggest core of what it is that we are doing. And if design is one part of the problem, the other side of the problem is sponsorship and is advertised emissions. In fact, I would be way more concerned in many ways about this. Sponsorship is isolatable and targetable. Advertised emissions is Google. It's the water in which that we are drinking every single day. It is the wide promotion of consumerism, of consumption, of dominion, of paradigms, of every single thing that we know about root cause issues is being actively fed to us like dopamine hits through every single app that we open on our phones. How do we go after this? It's called Scope X, if you want to add it into the Scope 1, 2, 3, and so on, if you're working on climate. But this is almost never tackled. There are a few people working on it, but not very many. And it's interesting, if we start to quantify risk, how do we start to run an end-to-end risk management, end-to-end liability, and track it right through to every single marketing and advertising budget on the planet? Then we get to where I think it gets really interesting. Because so far what I'm describing is in many ways the obvious stuff, even though deep work is rarely done in very integrated ways. But this stuff is where we have an opportunity to understand that the way in which one half of our brain functions, the way in which creative industries grow people, the way in which humanities train people to think about the tools for thinking, the tools for imagination, the tools for power and possibility, open up a set of capabilities that need to be embedded fully in our institutions. And one of the things that I often observe or hear is an immune system response from culture and creative industries to engage with vested interests, with the incumbent system, with the established order, and so on. And yet, that is exactly where the capacity to create irony and establish distance and start and notice assumptions and look at paradigms and cultural constructions and identify and speak about practices and habits and begin to make design choices, deliberate design choices, to be creative and generative, to come up with options. All of those things are needed in every industry, every institution, every policy making, and every single financial decision on this planet in the next 10 years. So where are we showing up? Because we're not there. We are asking for funding for a creative project, not being at the table, or we're at the table tokenistically, not a core part of it. And it has to go more than doing residencies or requiring. This is about really beginning to retrain the nerves, the decision paths, and the expectations of every single industry. And we cannot afford to be squeamish. And this is why I think, actually, when we hear and study carefully what the tech bros and the kind of successor civilization is calling out, they are calling out in many effective ways exactly what is needed. They're just happening to capture it for their own personal interests. So how the hell do we start to actually code for that and really get in there? Now, I know that it's not very easy. It's easy to say, not easy to do. There are instances in the work of cities. One of the things that we will launch from Climate-KIC next year is an effort to really up the ante on this in the city context called Green Space. There are cities that are trying to work on this. This is still token. And this is why I'm pulling it out, as it's still a marginal exercise. It's playful. It's about unlocking imagination. It's not institutional. This is a more interesting story. This is Skylar Tibbetts from MIT. Advanced manufacturing, but he does 4D printing, four-dimensional printing. So he prints with materials that are capable of changing themselves. The reason why I name this is because years ago when I was working in insurance in Australia, we were playing around, I was running a function or built a function that was creating massive options for the insurance industry to rescue itself from the cliff that it is now going over and give itself alternatives. And this showed up through that wide casting and building of relationships because he was able to print steel molecules in such a way that they would lock when they experienced a particular form of agitation. And this is a small story, but the reason why I'm naming this story is because it completely changed the minds of the company in which this happened. He prints in steel molecules. I was working in an Australian insurer. Most buildings in Australia have garage roller doors modeled on the US system, so they're soft steel or soft metal. And when cyclones come, which happen 2 or 3 times a year, the wind blows in the metal roller door, that creates a vacuum, the roof comes off, you lift the house. And you just see cyclone paths in Australia, it's just literally, as they go through, you just see every single house is gone. So we partnered with him, printed steel roller doors in this steel. When the wind buffets, the steel molecules lock, the door becomes as hard as concrete, you can't open it, but it doesn't blow in and the roof doesn't come off. The next cyclone, we didn't lose a single house. It was the quickest business case I've ever made to a board in my entire existence. And one of the interesting things is that the head of the investments guy, who was like, why are we playing around with experimental artists, had a complete epiphany moment on how do we hire as many experimental artists as possible. Now, I'm giving it to you as a tiny example because obviously this is a technology play. It isn't necessarily culture and creativity in all its forms, but it's a way of working out Trojan horses. How do you embed at just the right time an answer that shifts materially consciousness and understanding of what to do? And this is why I wanted to bring back Indy's slide from the opening session. Because if we're going to create economies of consciousness that really shift what it means to be who we are and how we're engaging and pull down on those or draw on those deep ontological shifts, we're going to need to work out how to go guerrilla and get embedded in everything and work every single angle. Technology solves, creative solves, policy changes, social imaginaries, every single thing. And my question is, how are we organizing for that? Because that's the thing I'm concerned about. It's not the individual capacities, is that this is the room, the world of culture meeting climate In a world of hyper-fragmented and siloed actions, this is the most fragmented field. This is the most dispersed, isolated, siloed, fragmented, hyper-competitive, scarce, worried, uncertain, and anxious field in the whole of human current civilization, except in some pockets of the world, but certainly in this part of the world. So how do we organize to make that different? And that goes a little bit to this question of how do we create an enabling institutional environment to shift, to create these organized injections, organized reorganizations of consciousness. Now, there are things in Europe that sadly are also not great stories, but opened up windows. This is an European Bauhaus. It has all of the absurdities. It was a project launched by Ursula von der Leyen because somebody who I happen to know rather well is the reason why I do the job I do, convinced her that it would be a fantastic thing to launch in order principally to promote the cause of bio-based materials in buildings. That's actually what this was about. It draws upon the German industrial Bauhaus tradition, and particularly draws upon, which is highly controversial, draws upon one particular notion, which is the idea of bringing together reindustrialization for sustainability with aesthetics. And it added in, for good measure, affordability, because this is Europe and just transition matters. It got launched, it had no budget, it had a political sponsor, which was the president, but she has no executive capabilities. It got captured immediately by the architecture industry, because this was finally an opportunity. I'm being really cynical, but this is what's happened. Because this was finally an opportunity to have a place in the sun for a lot of things that matter enormously. It has not quite managed. It has sort of calmed down a bit and gone a bit broader. But this is a Trojan horse. It's an opportunity to inject institutionally. It has now got budget. How would you wind together the whole panoply of what it is that culture means and the capacity to shift our sense of self, our consciousness, our practices, our institutions into the core of European competitiveness and in reindustrialization? How would we use it? And my question here is not, do you like it or not, but how would you organize it to turn that into an opportunity that is bigger than it currently is? And that's where I'm going to just draw on, towards close, a couple of the instances from history of where this has been done. This is the center of Florence. One of the things that is rarely known about Florence is that two things happened. The year after the Black Death, when 7 out of 10 people died in the space of in 18 months, Florence initiated a building program to create walls that were 8 times the size of the existing city. And it took them until the late 19th century, 1800s, to actually fill that space. Why did they do that? How could they have done that? And this building sits at the beginning, in the middle of a piazza that over 600 years was constructed as an entire system of the center of the city, asking individual residents to knock down the front of their houses, shift the building line back 14 centimeters and rebuild it at their own cost so that the street would be perfectly straight leading into this piazza. The viewing angle from the corner of the street to the building would be a perfect 45 degrees because Florence wished to claim being the new Rome. And it is not by accident. And it is the reason why Florentine Italian is modern Italian. Florentine institutions are the institutions of the modern Italian constitution. What they were doing was playing with something that is called the Donation of Constantine. It's a fictional document that was created in the collapse of the Roman Empire that created a split between power and authority. And it said power belongs to lay princes. I'm going to come to this guy in a minute, who live and die, wield enormous amounts of money, power over others, and they get to do what they want. Authority sits with God, with the church, and with cultural expression. Authority determines over time what it is that we believe and who we are. This man, Federico da Montefeltro, was a mercenary captain. He earned squillions. He's the most famous general of his day, if you like. He built a palace, and behind that little white thing at the very top is this room here. It is a room that is one of the most extraordinary expressions of erudite learning, of imagination, of tolerance, of wisdom, of humanity, of philosophy, of a capacity to understand the responsibility of a life, the responsibility of leadership, and the responsibility for civilization. He put it right behind that little white turret so that you open the doors to this thing and you see out over the whole landscape. He was deliberately playing with having power and using his resources to invest in authority. And we were discussing yesterday a lot of these questions about power. Cultural transformation plays with this distinction between in time, bounded by our lives, over time and through time, institutional change. And I think we need to start remembering, how do we start to design for a world that does that, that thinks about the authority? Because in the history of almost all histories of knowledge, what authority does is establish that that's the thing you cite, that's what you copy, that's what you replicate, that's what you perpetuate through time, that's what gives you authorship, that's where the word comes from. Authors create authority, authority creates a rightness to it. We need to work out how to authorize, in all senses of that word, an ecological civilization, which is why I'm coming to this. How do we reorganize and organize to create the kind of radical, deep, systemic transformations of identity, of practice, and of institutions that we need? And it means, how do we organize to make this big shift? I don't like binaries, but to make that core shift that is going from an industrial inheritance to a world that is based on an entanglement of consciousness, of identity, of understanding, of reciprocity, of regeneration, of love. And it means we're going to have to think about, how do we start to partner with China and stop having the absurd discussions that we are having about whether or not we can trust them? And how are we going to start designing for rhizomatic civilizations that are resilient enough to build and do this creative work of reimagining through a series of catastrophic crises that we know are coming? So we know that's there. It is about design, organization, and the capacity to understand, what is it? What is the object of design? The object of design is us, and the object of design is what comes out the other side of what it is that we're going to live through. So I also want to just recall back from yesterday, war thinking gets a war-made environment. So we are going to then need to think about, how do we remake something, or how do we make a civilization that manages to somehow be different and to use that capacity to get the difference that we need to see in ourselves broadly into the world. Of course, that also means the use of the word "we" is one of the most problematic of all. So let me finish there, and thank you for the time.